Rebecca Anderson had learned that hunger comes in layers. First, the stomach, obvious and simple. Then, the bones, a deeper ache that settles in the marrow and refuses to leave. But the worst kind lived in the throat, the kind that showed up when her 16-year-old son pretended he was full after 3 bites of a gas station sandwich. That hunger had teeth. Night 247 in the Toyota. The Walmart parking lot stretched dark and empty around them, sodium lights casting orange pools across cracked asphalt. Christopher lay curled in the passenger seat jacket, bunched under his head, breath fogging the window. Rebecca sat upright behind the wheel spine, stiff from months of sleeping vertical, and counted coins by the dome light. Quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, $23.67, enough for 2 days if they ate carefully, 3 if they stopped eating at all. The math never worked. It had stopped working the day the bank took the house, and it had gotten worse every week since. Rebecca closed her fist around the coins, felt their edges bite her palm, and wondered at what point survival stopped being noble and started being cruel. Christopher shifted, mumbled something in his sleep. Rebecca watched his face, still soft with the remnants of childhood, now stretched thin over cheekbones that had sharpened too fast. He had stopped asking when things would get better. That was how she knew they had broken something fundamental between them, some unspoken contract between mother and child that promised safety in exchange for trust. The security guard made his rounds at 2 in the morning, same as always. Rebecca pretended to be asleep when his flashlight swept across the windshield. He tapped the glass, once gentle. She kept her eyes closed. The flashlight moved on. Small mercies in a world that had run out of large ones. Morning arrived, gray and cold. Rebecca woke to the sound of engines, early shift workers starting their cars. Her neck screamed when she turned her head. Christopher was already awake, staring out the window, at nothing, jaw tight. They walked to the Walmart bathroom without speaking. Inside, Rebecca locked herself in a stall and changed her shirt, the clean one she kept folded in a plastic grocery bag. The fabric smelled like the inside of the car, like old upholstery and defeat. She washed her face at the sink, scrubbing hard enough to hurt, and stared at the mirror. The woman looking back had gray roots showing through cheap box dye circles under her eyes, so dark they looked like bruises, and a crease on her left cheek from where the seatbelt had pressed into her skin all night. A Walmart employee pushed through the door, glanced at Rebecca, then away. That look. Rebecca had learned to recognize it. Not quite pity, not quite disgust. Just the quick assessment people made when they had decided you were not their problem. She left before the employee could say anything. Christopher was waiting by the car, hands shoved in his pockets. The morning sun caught his face at an angle that made him look older than 16, harder. He had Michael's eyes, that same steady gray that used to make Rebecca feel safe. Now they just made her chest hurt. 3 years ago, none of this existed. 3 years ago, there had been a kitchen with yellow curtains, a mortgage they could almost afford, and a husband who came home smelling like copper wire and kissed her forehead before dinner. Michael Anderson had been a union electrician, good at his work, careful with heights and current and the 1,000 small dangers that came with the job. But careful had not been enough the day a site supervisor rushed a job, cut corners on safety checks, and sent Michael up a ladder that should have been grounded. The shock had stopped his heart for 90 seconds. The EMTs brought him back, but the oxygen deprivation had already started eating holes in his brain. 8 weeks in ICU. 8 weeks of doctors using words like traumatic and irreversible and quality of life. 8 weeks of Rebecca sitting in a vinyl chair watching machines breathe for her husband while the bills piled up like snow in a blizzard. Michael died on March 14, 2020. The same week, the world shut down for a virus nobody understood yet. Rebecca had stood in an empty hospital hallway, mask on her face, and signed papers that released his body while nurses hurried past, carrying extra ventilators. The funeral home was closed. The church was closed. She buried her husband with 5 people present, all standing 6 feet apart, and went home to a mailbox full of medical bills that insurance had decided were not their responsibility. $264,000. That was the number that ended Rebecca's old life. The hospital wanted it. The collection agencies wanted it. The mortgage company wanted their own piece. Rebecca worked 2 jobs, sold everything that had value, and watched the house slip away anyway because the math had stopped working, and no amount of effort could make it start again. The car had been her last stand, a 2008 Toyota with a dented bumper and seats that smelled like French fries. It ran. It locked. It became home. The phone rang while Rebecca was sitting in the driver's seat trying to decide whether $23 meant breakfast or gas. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Spam calls were the only people who called her anymore. But she answered. The voice on the other end was male, professional, careful. "Mrs. Anderson, this is Kenneth Taylor. I'm an attorney with Harrow and Pike Estate Services here in Asheville. I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Cross." Rebecca's mind went blank. "And I think you have the wrong person." Rebecca Lynn Anderson, married to Michael James Anderson, deceased 2020. Her stomach dropped. "Yes? Then I have the right person. Mrs. Cross passed away 3 weeks ago. According to her will, you are listed as next of kin for one remaining property transfer." The word property hit her like voltage. Not money, not a check, but maybe land. Maybe something she could sell. Maybe something that meant the Walmart parking lot could finally end. What kind of property? Kenneth Taylor paused, the kind of pause lawyers made when they were choosing their words. A structure, a log cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, built sometime in the 1940s. Remote location, no utilities, significant structural damage. The county assessment values it at $50. Rebecca heard the number and felt something crack inside her chest. Not disappointment exactly. Something worse. The exhausted realization that even when life handed her something, it made sure that something was worthless first. $50. "Yes, ma'am. I understand this may not be what you were hoping for." Christopher was watching her now, eyes sharp with questions. Rebecca turned away. "Can I sell it?" "Legally, yes. Practically, I'm not sure who would buy it. The access road is barely passable. The structure itself is not habitable in its current condition." Rebecca closed her eyes. "Then why are you calling me?" "Because the transfer is legally required, and because Mrs. Cross left a note with the paperwork. I can mail it to you, or, if you prefer to come to the office, I'll come." She did not know why she said it. Probably because sitting in Kenneth Taylor's office would be warm and would not cost gas money if she timed it right. Probably because she had nothing else to do with her day except count coins and fail at basic math. Kenneth gave her the address. Rebecca wrote it on the back of a receipt with a pen that barely worked. They drove to Asheville in silence. The Toyota coughed on hills but kept moving. Rebecca parked 3 blocks from the law office because street parking was free, and the garage charged $5. She and Christopher walked the rest of the way, past boutique coffee shops and art galleries, and people who looked like they had never counted coins by dome light in their entire lives. The law office was exactly what Rebecca expected. Polished wood leather chairs, carpet so thick it swallowed sound. The receptionist looked up when they entered, and Rebecca watched her eyes do the same quick assessment the Walmart employee had done. Not our kind of people. Kenneth Taylor met them in a conference room that smelled like furniture polish and old money. He was younger than Rebecca expected, maybe late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen enough estate fights to be permanently exhausted by human nature. He shook her hand, nodded at Christopher, and opened a thin folder. Mrs. Cross was your second cousin on your father's side. You may not have known her. Rebecca shook her head. I didn't. She lived alone for most of her life. No children, few friends. When she passed, there was very little estate to speak of. Medical bills took most of it. What remains is this property. He slid a document across the table. Rebecca looked at the words without reading them. Legal language dense and meaningless. But one phrase jumped out. Appraised value $50. Kenneth continued, his voice careful. The cabin has been abandoned for at least a decade, possibly longer. The roof has significant damage. There is no running water, no electricity. The land itself has minimal commercial value due to its remote location and lack of road access, suitable for development. Christopher leaned forward. Then why is it even worth filing paperwork? Kenneth looked at him, something that might have been respect flickering across his face. Because legally it is still property, and Mrs. Cross wanted it to go to family. He pulled an envelope from the folder sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Rebecca took it, felt the weight of old paper, and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet handwriting, thin and spidery, with age. To whoever arrives hollow, the cabin cannot feed you, but it might remember what hunger feels like. Rebecca read it twice. Christopher read it over her shoulder. That's it. Kenneth nodded. I'm afraid so. Rebecca folded the note carefully, slid it back into the envelope. From somewhere down the hallway, she heard laughter. Not loud, not directed at her, but she heard it anyway and felt heat crawl up her neck. A $50 cabin, a cryptic note from a dead woman, 11 months living in a car, and this was what the universe decided to hand her. One last joke before the punchline killed her. She stood, legs shaking. Thank you for your time. Kenneth stood as well. Mrs. Anderson, I know this is not what you hoped for, but the land is yours. If you want to inspect the property, I can provide directions and keys. Rebecca looked at the envelope in her hand, at the note inside that made no sense, at the $50 cabin that was probably rotting in the woods somewhere nobody cared about. She looked at Christopher, who was watching her with that careful expression he had learned to wear, the one that said he would follow her lead, no matter how stupid that lead turned out to be. Give me the address. They left Asheville with a manila envelope full of paperwork, a set of keys that looked older than Rebecca, and directions to a place called Cross Hollow in the Appalachian backcountry. Christopher read the directions out loud while Rebecca drove voice flat. Take Route 74 west for 40 miles, exit at Crabtree, follow County Road 19 north until pavement ends, continue on dirt road approximately 8 miles. Property is marked by stone post on left. 8 miles of dirt road. That's what it says. Rebecca checked the gas gauge. Quarter tank, just enough to get them there and maybe back if they did not waste fuel. The Toyota climbed into the mountain's engine, whining transmission slipping on grades. The trees thickened, as they drove pines and hardwoods pressing close to the road, shadows deep even in midday. They passed Crabtree, barely a town, just a gas station and a post office and a handful of houses that looked like they had been built before roads were common. County Road 19 started paved, but gave up after 6 miles, dissolving into gravel and red clay. The Toyota was not built for this. Rebecca felt every rut, every washout, every place where rain had carved gullies across the road. The GPS lost signal. Christopher navigated by landmarks, pointing out the turnoffs Kenneth's directions had mentioned. Creek on the right, dead oak on the left, mailbox with no name. They were 12 miles from the nearest town when the blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Rebecca's heart stopped. She pulled over, hands shaking, and watched the sheriff's cruiser park behind them. The deputy who approached was maybe 30, built like someone who had played football in high school and never quite let go of the weight. He tapped on the window with 2 knuckles. Rebecca rolled it down. License and registration. She handed them over, mouth dry. The deputy studied her license, then looked past her into the back seat. Rebecca knew what he saw. Blankets folded in stacks, plastic bags full of clothes, a cooler that held their food, everything they owned visible and pathetic. Taillights out, left rear. Rebecca swallowed. I didn't know. The deputy's eyes moved to Christopher, then back to Rebecca. You folks living in this vehicle? The question landed like a fist. Rebecca felt Christopher go still beside her. We're traveling, visiting family. The deputy's expression did not change, but something in his posture said he knew she was lying and was deciding whether to care. He looked at the registration at the address that was not real anymore because the bank had taken it, looked at the expired inspection sticker Rebecca could not afford to fix, looked at the 2 people in a beaten Toyota with everything they owned packed in garbage bags. He handed back her license. Get that taillight fixed and find a campground if you're planning to stay in the area. Sleeping in vehicles on public roads is not permitted in this county. Rebecca nodded, throat too tight for words. The deputy walked back to his cruiser, sat there for a full minute, writing something in his computer, then drove past them without looking back. Christopher let out a breath he had been holding. That was close. Rebecca's hands were still shaking. She started the engine and drove slower now, watching the mirror for blue lights that did not return. The dirt road narrowed to barely 1 lane. Branches scraped the roof. The GPS stayed dead. After another 3 miles, Christopher pointed. There! A stone post leaning slightly moss, growing thick on the north side. No marker, no name, just Tursa. Just weathered granite that had been there long enough to sink into the earth. Rebecca turned onto an even narrower track, more path than road, and the Toyota scraped bottom twice before the trees opened into a clearing. The cabin stood in the center like something the forest had tried to swallow and failed. Small, maybe 20 feet by 30 log walls, dark with age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle but had not collapsed. 3 windows, 2 intact, 1 boarded over with planks that did not match the original wood. A porch that listed to one side, missing railings and half its floorboards. Weeds grew waist-high in the yard. Rebecca turned off the engine. Silence rushed in, broken only by wind moving through the pines. "This is it." Christopher's voice was quiet, almost reverent with disbelief. Rebecca stared at the cabin and felt something twist in her chest. Not hope. She had given up on hope somewhere around month 6 in the Walmart lot. But maybe the ghost of it, the memory of what hope used to feel like before hunger and shame ground it down to nothing. They got out of the car. The air smelled like pine sap and wet earth, and something older, the smell of wood that had stood too long in one place. Rebecca walked to the porch, tested the first step with her weight. It groaned but held. Christopher followed more cautious hands out for balance. The front door was locked. Rebecca tried the key Kenneth had given her. It fought the lock rust against rust, then turned. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed. The inside was darker than Rebecca expected. What light came through the dirty windows fell in slanted beams, catching dust that hung in the air like fog. One main room, maybe 15 by 20 feet. A black wood stove in the corner, squat and heavy. A table against one wall, 2 chairs both still upright. A stone hearth where a fireplace had been, though the chimney was blocked with debris. In the back, a narrow doorway led to what looked like a bedroom, small and windowless. But what stopped Rebecca cold was the floor. Not the boards themselves, which were scuffed and stained, but what sat on them. A plastic cup, a spoon, a wrapper from a granola bar, recent enough that the colors had not faded. Christopher saw it too. Someone was here. Rebecca bent down, picked up the cup, still slightly damp on the inside. Recently. They searched the cabin room by room, moving quietly, listening for sounds of occupation. The bedroom held a rusted bed frame and a dresser with drawers that stuck when Christopher pulled them. Empty, except for mouse droppings and the smell of old wood. The main room had nothing hidden, nothing dangerous. But the signs were there, footprints in the dust that were not theirs. A blanket wadded in the corner, thin and stained. Outside, behind the cabin, they found a trash bag with empty soup cans and cracker boxes, maybe 2 or 3 months old. Christopher stood in the yard, looking at the tree line. What if they come back? Rebecca did not answer because she did not have one. Instead, she walked around the cabin, checking windows, testing doors. The back entrance had been jimmied open. At some point, the lock broken, the frame splintered. Whoever had been living here had not asked permission. The sun was starting to sink when Rebecca made her decision. We're staying. Christopher turned. Here, in the car, like always, but here. What if? Then we deal with it. They ate dinner in the Toyota, parked where they could see both the cabin and the road. Peanut butter on bread that was starting to go stale, apples that had bruises spreading like infections. Christopher chewed slowly, making it last, and Rebecca watched him and hated every single choice that had led them to this moment. Night came fast in the mountains. The trees turned black against a sky that was more stars than darkness. Rebecca locked the car doors and reclined her seat as far as it would go, which was not far enough to be comfortable. Christopher curled in the passenger seat with his jacket pulled over his shoulders. At 2 in the morning, something woke her. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of sound, the way the forest had gone still in a way that meant something was moving through it. Rebecca sat up slowly, heart hammering, and strained to see through the windshield. The cabin was a darker shape, against dark trees, windows like empty eye sockets. Then light. A flicker inside the cabin, small and moving. Flashlight or candle, she could not tell which. Rebecca's breath stopped. Christopher woke to her hand on his shoulder, his eyes snapping open. She pointed. He saw the light and went rigid. They sat frozen, watching. The light moved from window to window, whoever held it searching or settling in. Rebecca's mind raced through options. Drive away, stay silent, confront, call the police, except her phone had no signal out here, and she had no idea if the police would even come for a squatter in a $50 cabin. The light stopped moving. A shadow crossed one window. Human-shaped, broad-shouldered. Rebecca made a decision that was probably stupid but felt necessary. She grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, opened her door as quietly as she could, and stood. Christopher hissed her name, but she ignored him. Her legs shook as she walked toward the cabin, flashlight pointed down. At the porch steps, she called out, voice harder than she felt. "I'm calling the police. You need to leave now." The light inside the cabin went out. Silence. Then the front door opened, and a man stepped onto the porch. He was in his 40s, maybe hard to tell in the dark. Tall, broad, wearing a jacket that had seen better years and boots held together with duct tape. His face was hidden in shadow, but his posture was careful, hands visible, non-threatening. "Easy. I'm not looking for trouble." Rebecca raised her flashlight, pointing it at his face. He squinted, but did not move. "This is private property." "Didn't know anyone owned it. Been using this place couple months. Thought it was abandoned." Behind her, she heard Christopher get out of the car, heard his footsteps in the dirt. "Well, someone owns it now. Me." The man looked past her to the Toyota, to Christopher, who had picked up a tire iron and was holding it like he knew what to do with it, even though they both knew he did not. "You gonna live here?" Rebecca did not answer because she did not know. The man seemed to hear the silence and understand it. He looked at the car again, at the blankets visible through the windows, at Rebecca's clothes that were clean but worn, at Christopher, who was trying to look older and tougher than 16. "You're like me." It was not a question. Rebecca's throat closed. The man nodded slowly, like he had confirmed something. "Nowhere else to go." He stepped off the porch, moving past Rebecca without getting close. She turned to track him, flashlight following. He walked to the tree line and stopped, looked back. "Word of advice. Don't sleep in the cabin your first night. Place has been empty long enough that you don't know what's made nests in the walls. And if you're staying, fix that back door. Anyone can walk in." Then he was gone, vanishing into the trees like he had never been more than shadow. Christopher came to stand beside Rebecca, still gripping the tire iron. "What do we do?" Rebecca stared at the dark forest where the man had disappeared. "We lock the cabin from the inside and sleep there anyway, because I'm not giving up the first roof we've had in 11 months just because someone else used it first." They hauled their essentials inside: blankets, the cooler, their bag of clothes. Christopher wedged a chair under the back doorknob to keep it shut. Rebecca locked the front door and shoved the table against it for good measure. They spread blankets on the floor in front of the wood stove, neither of them willing to test the bedroom or the rusted bed frame. Rebecca lay awake in the dark, listening to Christopher breathe, listening to the cabin settle and creak around them, listening for footsteps that never came. Somewhere in the small hours she finally slept, and when she woke, pale light was filtering through dirty windows, and her back hurt from the floor, but they were inside, and that meant something, even if she did not yet know what. Morning brought clarity and dust in equal measure. Rebecca and Christopher spent the first hour just looking, taking inventory of what $50 had bought them. The wood stove was functional, or had been once, the door rusted shut, but the body intact. The table and chairs were solid, handmade, the kind of furniture built to outlast the people who used it. The hearth was blocked with old bird nests and leaves, but the stonework was sound. In the bedroom, Christopher found the dresser drawers would open if you pulled hard enough, empty except for mouse droppings and the smell of abandonment. He checked under the bed frame and found nothing but dust and a single work glove stiff with age. Rebecca went outside to look for a water source. The well she found 50 feet from the cabin, half hidden by weeds. The wooden cover was warped and heavy, but she managed to lift it. She shone her flashlight down into darkness, expecting water, finding nothing but dry stone walls going down into black. Except, there, about 8 feet down, barely visible, something caught the light. Not water, something else, something that did not belong in an empty well. Rebecca knelt at the edge, leaning in, squinting. A plastic bag, tied to something secured to the stone wall by what looked like wire. Recent, not ancient. The plastic was still intact. She called for Christopher. He came running, saw where she was pointing, and did not hesitate. He sat on the edge of the well, legs dangling, then lowered himself down, using the stones as handholds. Rebecca held the flashlight, her heart in her throat, watching her son descend into a dry well to retrieve something that might be garbage or might be important, because they were desperate enough now that the difference did not matter. Christopher reached the bag unwound, the wire, climbed back up with it, clutched under one arm. When he surfaced, they both sat on the grass, breathing hard, and opened the bag. Inside, a brass compass, old but functional. 3 stones, small and irregular, that Christopher thought were just rocks, until Rebecca held one to the light and saw facets, saw the way it split the sunlight into colors. A sheet of paper wrapped in plastic still dry, and a key iron, heavy, the kind that opened old locks. Christopher unfolded the paper. The handwriting was the same thin script from the note Kenneth Taylor had given them. If you found this, you looked past comfort for survival. The compass points true north. The key opens what most people forgot to value. Rebecca read it 3 times. Christopher held the compass, watching the needle swing and settle. North, always north, no matter which way he turned. What does it mean? Rebecca took one of the stones, felt its weight, its unnatural smoothness. I think these are real. Real what? Gemstones, uncut, raw. Christopher stared at the stones like they might bite him. How much are they worth? I don't know. Could be nothing. Could be something. They sat in the grass, the well gaping behind them, and looked at what they had found. A compass. 3 stones that might be valuable. A key that opened something they had not found yet. And a note that promised meaning without delivering clarity. Christopher broke the silence. We should search the cabin again. They did. This time with purpose, with the understanding that if someone had hidden one thing, they had probably hidden more. Rebecca checked the wood stove, trying to pry open the rusted door. It would not budge. Christopher examined the walls, knocking on boards, listening for hollow sounds that meant hidden spaces. Nothing. They were sitting at the table, defeated and hungry, when the sound of an engine broke through the forest quiet. Both of them froze. A vehicle coming up the track. Not the same sound as the Toyota. Something older, rougher. Rebecca stood moved to the window. A pickup truck, maybe 1990s, vintage, more rust than paint, pulled into the clearing. An old man climbed out, moving slowly, favoring his right leg. He wore work clothes and carried a paper bag. Rebecca met him at the door, Christopher behind her, both of them tense. The old man stopped at the porch steps, not climbing them, giving them space. Heard someone finally took the cross place. His voice was rough years of cigarettes and mountain air. Rebecca said nothing. The old man lifted the bag. Brought sandwiches. Figured you might need food more than questions. Rebecca's defenses cracked slightly. Who are you? George Allen. Live about 2 miles down the valley. Seen a lot of people come look at this place over the years. You're the first ones who stayed overnight. He climbed the steps, handed the bag to Christopher. Inside were 2 thick sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, still warm. Christopher's stomach growled loudly enough for everyone to hear. George smiled. Eat, then we'll talk. They sat on the porch, Rebecca and Christopher sharing the sandwiches, while George settled on the steps, looking out at the clearing. He did not ask questions while they ate, just waited patient in the way of people who had learned that silence got answers faster than interrogation. Rebecca finished first, her stomach cramping from food after too long without enough. Thank you, George nodded. Margaret was good people, quiet, kept to herself after her grandfather died. Edward Cross. That's right. You know about him. Only what the lawyer told me. George was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. Edward Cross was complicated. Made his money in timber back in the 30s and 40s. Bought up half this mountain. Then his family started fighting over it. Brothers' cousins didn't matter. Everybody wanted a piece. Edward decided he'd rather hide his money than watch them tear each other apart for it. Christopher leaned forward. Hide it where? George looked at him with eyes that were still sharp despite age. That's the question, isn't it? Edward used to say, value hides in plain sight for the right eyes. Folks thought he went crazy. Turned out he just knew his own people better than they knew themselves. Rebecca pulled the compass from her pocket, held it where George could see. Does this mean anything to you? George studied it without touching it, and something flickered across his face. Not surprise, recognition. Where'd you find that in the well? George nodded slowly. Then you're smarter than most who came looking. Or hungrier. Sometimes that's the same thing. He stood, joints popping. Don't judge this place by its boards, Mrs. Anderson, and don't trust anyone who offers to buy it without knowing what's underneath. He walked back to his truck, climbed in. Before starting the engine, he called out, You need anything? I'm in the phone book under Allen, George Allen, only one in the county. Then he drove away, leaving Rebecca and Christopher on the porch with more questions than they had started with, and the slow, dangerous feeling that maybe the $50 cabin was something other than a joke after all. They spent the afternoon testing the compass, watching it point north from every corner of the cabin, every spot in the clearing. Unchanging, reliable, the kind of north that meant magnetic pull iron in the earth, something fixed. Except when Christopher walked into the cabin and stood near the wood stove, the needle wavered, spun, refused to settle. He called Rebecca over. Look! She stood where he pointed. The compass in her hand went wild, needle swinging in circles, searching for north and finding interference instead. Metal, Christopher said. Has to be. Something big enough to mess with the compass. Rebecca looked at the stove. Cast iron, old and heavy, but just a stove. She tried the door again, still rusted shut, but the way it sat on the floor, the way the stones beneath it were darker than the others, weren't smooth, like someone had stood there often. She knelt, ran her hands along the base. 4 bolts held it to the floor, sunk deep into the stone. 3 were black with age and rust. The 4th was newer, or at least less corroded. Someone had replaced it or removed it and put it back. Christopher was already getting the wrench from the car. The bolts fought them. Rebecca's hands slipped, knuckles scraping stone. Christopher leaned his full weight on the wrench until his face went red. 1 bolt gave with a shriek of metal, then another. The 3rd took both of them straining, Christopher pulling while Rebecca held the stove steady. The fourth bolt came free, and something shifted beneath them, a sound like stone grinding on stone. They looked at each other, then at the stove. Together they pushed. The stove scraped across the floor, heavy and resisting, until it had moved far enough to reveal what it had been hiding. Not a hole, not a chamber, just stone darker than the rest, fitted together with precision that did not match the crude floor around it, and set into the center, nearly an invisible, unless you were looking for it, a seam. A crack, the outline of something that could be lifted if you knew how. Christopher found the iron ring first, his fingers catching the edge where it sat flush with the stone. He pulled. Rebecca helped. The stone slab lifted with a grinding reluctance, revealing darkness underneath. They had found Edward Cross's hiding place. The shaft was narrow, maybe 3 feet square, lined with stone that went down deeper than the flashlight could reach. Not a well, a vault, a place built to last, to protect, to keep secret whatever someone had decided was worth more than family trust. Christopher started to climb down, but Rebecca grabbed his arm. "Wait!" She shone the light down, looking for snakes, for rot, for the 1,000 things that could kill you in old, dark places. The beam caught something at the bottom. Metal. A box. Christopher went down anyway, moving carefully, feet finding handholds in the stone. Rebecca held the light and counted his breaths and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. He reached the bottom, called up. "There's a safe. Small one, not locked." "Can you lift it?" "Yeah. Heavy, though." He passed it up first, straining. Rebecca grabbed it, pulled it onto the floor. Then Christopher climbed back out, hands scraped, breathing hard. They sat on the cabin floor in the failing light and looked at what they had found. A metal safe, old and spotted with rust, but intact. A leather document case wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry despite the years. Both small enough to fit in the vault, both clearly placed there by human hands with specific intent. Rebecca opened the safe first. Inside, packed in velvet that had gone brown with age, 7 gold coins, heavy and real. 2 rough gemstones larger than the ones from the well. A small cloth bag that clinked when Christopher touched it, and an envelope sealed with wax that had cracked. Rebecca broke the seal. The letter inside was written in the same hand as before, but this one was longer, more direct. "You found the first cache. This proves you're not a fool. But this is not the inheritance. This is the test. The real value is where the compass points when the key fits the lock that doesn't look like a lock. Greed sees gold. Wisdom sees shelter first." Christopher read it over her shoulder, then read it again. "There's more." Rebecca's hands were shaking. She looked at the gold coins, at the stones that were probably worth thousands, at the cash equivalent of everything they needed to escape the Toyota and the Walmart lot, and the endless mathematics of poverty. And the letter said this was just a test. She thought about the compass, about the key they had found, about George Allen's warning not to judge the place by its boards, about the way the wood stove had been bolted down like it was guarding something more than heat. Somewhere in the cabin, probably close, was the real inheritance, the thing Edward Cross had hidden from his own family because they had valued money more than blood. Rebecca looked at Christopher, saw her own wild hope reflected in his face, and made a decision. "We tell no one. Mom? No one. Not until we find the rest. Because if anyone knows we found this much, they'll come, and they won't ask nicely." Christopher nodded slowly. They hid the safe in the trunk of the Toyota, covered it with blankets and bags. The coins, the stones, the letter, all of it locked in the car because Rebecca trusted the Toyota more than she trusted walls. Night fell again. They ate the last of their food down to peanut butter on stale bread and sat in the cabin with the wood stove pushed aside and the stone vault gaping open in the floor like a mouth that had finally spoken after decades of silence. The compass pointed north. The key waited for a lock that did not look like a lock. And somewhere in or around this $50 cabin was enough money to change their lives if they could find it before someone else did. Rebecca lay on the floor that night, Christopher asleep beside her, and stared at the ceiling beams. She thought about Michael, about the medical bills, about the Walmart parking lot, and the security guard who had been kind enough to pretend not to see them. She thought about the note, "To whoever arrives hollow." She had arrived hollow, empty, scraped clean by loss and hunger and shame. But maybe, just maybe, she had arrived at exactly the right time. Outside, wind moved through the pines. The cabin creaked and settled. And in the dark, Rebecca allowed herself something she had not permitted in 11 months. She allowed herself to hope. Dawn arrived with frost on the windshield and Rebecca's breath visible in the cabin air. She woke stiff from the floor, Christopher already up and standing near the open vault, staring down into the darkness like it might offer different answers in daylight. They had spent half the night analyzing Edward Cross's letter, turning each phrase over, searching for meaning in the spaces between words. The real value is where the compass points when the key fits the lock that doesn't look like a lock. The compass pointed north from everywhere, except near the stove where magnetic interference made the needle spin. The key they had found was too large for any door in the cabin, too old-fashioned for modern locks. Christopher spread the documents from the leather case across the table. Deeds, survey maps, transfer papers, so old the ink had faded to brown. Most were illegible, water-damaged, despite the oilcloth, but one map caught Rebecca's attention. Hand-drawn, simple, showing the cabin as a square, the well as a circle, and something else. A small X marked in the woods to the north. She held it to the window light, squinting. "Look at this." Christopher came over. The map had a notation in the corner, barely visible 40 paces, end wall. They stood at the cabin's north wall. 5 minutes later, Rebecca holding the compass steady, while Christopher counted steps. The needle pointed true north into the forest. 40 paces took them to a cluster of large stones, moss-covered, half-buried in decades of fallen leaves. Christopher kicked at the leaves, exposing more stone. "We can't move these by hand." Rebecca already knew that. The stones were granite, each one probably weighing several hundred pounds. Moving them would require tools they did not own and muscle they did not have. She looked at the map again, at the X that promised something valuable enough that Edward Cross had buried it under literal tons of rock. "We need a pry bar, rope, maybe a come-along." Christopher wiped his hands on his jeans. "That's going to cost money." Rebecca thought about the gold coins in the trunk of the Toyota. 7 of them, heavy and real, and probably worth more than anything she had touched in years. Selling one meant exposure, meant questions, meant someone would know they had found something valuable. But digging with bare hands was not an option. "We sell 1 coin, just one, and we don't say where it came from." They drove to town that afternoon, the gold coin wrapped in cloth and tucked in Rebecca's jacket pocket. She had chosen the smallest one, hoping it would attract less attention. Christopher sat silent in the passenger seat, tension rolling off him in waves. The pawn shop was on a side street in Asheville, the kind of place with barred windows and a buzzer on the door. Inside, the air smelled like old electronics and desperation. A man in his 60s looked up from behind bulletproof glass eyes, sharp despite thick glasses. Rebecca placed the coin on the counter. The man picked it up, turned it over, held it under a magnifying lamp. His expression did not change, but something in his posture tightened. "Where'd you get this?" Rebecca kept her voice level. "Family heirloom. This is an 1893 Liberty head. Gold. You know what it's worth. That's why I'm here." The man weighed it on a scale, consulted a chart on his computer. The silence stretched too long. Rebecca felt sweat forming under her arms despite the cold. Current gold spot is $18.50 an ounce. This is .967 ounces pure content. Collector value adds premium. I can do $1,400 cash. Rebecca had expected lowball. Pawn shops always lowballed, but $1,400 was enough for tools, enough for gas, enough to keep them fed while they figured out what the map meant. "Deal!" The man counted out bills, mostly 20s, and slid them across, but his eyes stayed on Rebecca, calculating. "You got more of these?" "No." "Funny. Don't see coins like this often. They haven't been in circulation since 1933. Most ended up melted or in private collections." Rebecca pocketed the money without responding. The man's gaze followed her to the door. "You change your mind about selling more. I'll beat any offer in town." Rebecca left without answering. Outside, Christopher was waiting by the car, eyes scanning the street. "We need to go now." She heard it in his voice, the edge of panic barely controlled. She got in the car, started the engine. "What's wrong?" "Black pickup. Been parked across the street since we got here. Same truck that was on the mountain road yesterday." Rebecca checked the mirror. A Ford F-15, maybe 15 years old, primer gray, where rust had been cut out and never repainted. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside. She pulled out of the parking space and drove not fast, not slow, just normal. The pickup followed. Through 3 turns, through 2 lights, staying 4 cars back, but never losing them. Rebecca's hands tightened on the wheel. "Lose them or lead them away from the cabin." Christopher's voice was tight. "Can't lose them without making it obvious. And they probably know where we're going anyway." Rebecca made a decision. She drove to a hardware store parking lot, busy with Saturday customers, and parked near the entrance where witnesses and cameras would see everything. The pickup cruised past, slowed, then kept going. Whoever was driving did not want attention any more than Rebecca did. They stayed in the hardware store for an hour, buying a pry bar, 50 feet of rope, work gloves, a decent LED flashlight. Rebecca paid cash and felt the weight of the remaining bills in her pocket, already doing math on how long it would last. The pickup did not reappear on the drive back to the cabin, but Rebecca checked the mirror every 30 seconds anyway. The paranoia that came with being hunted settled into her bones like old arthritis. They reached the cabin as shadows were lengthening. Rebecca parked the Toyota facing the road, ready for fast exit if needed, and carried their purchases inside. The tools looked inadequate against the memory of those stones, but they would have to be enough. Christopher was unpacking the rope when the sound of an engine made them both freeze. Not the pickup, something else, expensive sounding. Rebecca moved to the window. A black Mercedes sedan, clean and new, picking its way up the dirt road like it was offended by the terrain. It stopped in the clearing. A man got out. He was in his 60s, silver hair perfectly cut, wearing a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than the Toyota was worth. His boots were leather still shiny despite the mud. He did not knock on the door, just stood on the porch like he had been invited, like he belonged there more than Rebecca did. She opened the door before he could knock, putting herself between him and the interior of the cabin. "Can I help you?" The man smiled warm and practiced. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm Donald Wilson. I own several properties in this county." He extended a business card. Rebecca took it without looking at it. "I'm not interested in selling." Donald's smile did not falter. "I apologize for showing up unannounced. I wanted to catch you before your day got started. I'm conducting research on historical properties in the region. The cross-family holdings are particularly interesting from a development perspective." Christopher appeared behind Rebecca, arms crossed. "What kind of development?" Donald's eyes flicked to him, assessed, dismissed. "Mostly land use studies, boundary surveys, tax history, boring administrative work." Rebecca kept her voice flat. "This isn't a good time." Donald nodded like he understood, but his eyes were moving past her, taking in what he could see of the cabin interior, the pushed-aside stove, the open vault in the floor. "Of course. I just had a few questions about when your relative acquired this land. County records show some interesting gaps in the chain of title going back to the 1940s.
I don't know anything about that. Naturally, it's all very technical. But if you find any old documents, survey maps, that sort of thing, I'd be happy to help interpret them. Sometimes old parcels were larger than current boundaries suggest." Christopher's jaw tightened. "Why do you care?" Donald turned to him, and the warmth in his expression cooled by several degrees. "I buy distressed properties. This cabin needs at least $30,000 in repairs to be habitable. That's money most people don't have. I can save you the trouble and expense." Rebecca's stomach dropped. 30,000. He had numbers ready, which meant he had done research, which meant he knew more about this place than he was admitting. "How much are you offering?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Donald's smile returned sharper now. 18,000, cash, today." $18,000. It was almost exactly what Rebecca would have gotten if she had taken Kenneth Taylor's advice and sold immediately. It was enough to rent an apartment, buy furniture, give Christopher a bedroom with a door that closed. It was salvation wearing a camel coat and holding a checkbook. But Donald had shown up the day after she sold a gold coin in town, and he had numbers ready. And he was standing on her porch, asking questions about documents, while his eyes cataloged everything visible through the open door. "We're not selling." Donald's expression did not change, but something happened in his eyes, a calculation cold and quick. "Mrs. Anderson, I heard you were at Miller's pawn shop yesterday." The words landed like a slap. Rebecca's breath stopped. Christopher went rigid beside her. "Small town. Word travels. If you need cash badly enough to sell family heirlooms, my offer is considerably more generous than pawning your assets piece by piece." Rebecca's voice came out harder than she felt. "Thanks for the offer. We're not interested." Donald pulled a second business card from his pocket, wrote something on the back, handed it to her. "My personal cell. Call me when you change your mind." He walked back to the Mercedes, unhurried, and paused with his hand on the door. "Be careful out here, Mrs. Anderson. Mountains can be dangerous for people who don't know them well." The words were mild, almost friendly. The threat underneath was sharp enough to cut. He drove away. Rebecca and Christopher stood on the porch watching dust settle in his wake.
Christopher's voice was barely above a whisper. How did he know? Rebecca already knew the answer. Jerry Miller at the pawn shop had made a phone call the moment she left, probably to someone who paid for tips about unusual items coming through town. People who bought distressed properties made their living on information networks, on knowing when desperation created opportunity. We have to find whatever's under those stones, today. They worked until dark fell, prying at the rocks with the crowbar, digging around the edges with a folding shovel Christopher found in the Toyota's trunk. The stones were wedged together, packed in by decades of soil and root growth. Progress came in inches. By the time they gave up for the night, they had exposed enough to confirm what Rebecca had feared. This would take days, maybe weeks, and they did not have that kind of time. Christopher sat on the ground, hands raw, despite the gloves. What if we're digging in the wrong place? Rebecca looked at the map again in the flashlight beam. 40 paces from the north wall. The X was clear, but Edward Cross's riddle kept circling through her head. Where the compass points when the key fits the lock, that doesn't look like a lock. She stood, walked back to the cabin, Christopher following. The compass still went wild near the wood stove. The key still had no obvious purpose. Rebecca stared at the stove, at the mechanism they had not fully explored, because they had been too excited about the vault underneath. Help me with this. Together they examined the stove from every angle. It was cast iron, old solid. The door was rusted shut, had been for years probably. But when Rebecca ran her fingers along the bottom edge, she felt something. A seam, not part of the original casting, an addition. Christopher saw where she was looking and grabbed the pry bar. He wedged it into the seam and pulled. Metal shrieked. The bottom panel of the stove came loose, revealing a hollow compartment. Inside was a hand crank iron, like the key fitted into gears that ran down through the floor. Rebecca's breath caught. Try the key. Christopher took the key from his pocket, the one from the well, and fitted it into a socket on the crank's axle. It slid home, perfectly locked into place, with a solid click. Turn it? Christopher gripped the crank and pulled. It resisted, seized by decades of disuse, then gave with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. He turned it clockwise, straining, and somewhere beneath them something responded. Stone, grinding on stone, gears engaging, a mechanism waking after 50 years of silence. The floorboards 3 feet from the stove began to rise. Rebecca and Christopher stepped back, watching in stunned silence as a section of floor lifted on hidden hinges, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Not a simple vault like before. A room. A chamber built under the cabin with the kind of engineering that required planning, money, and absolute paranoia about who might come looking. Rebecca grabbed the LED flashlight and shone it down. Concrete walls. A space maybe 8 feet by 8 feet with a ceiling just tall enough to stand in. And filling almost every inch of floor space, 2 large metal safes, a wooden crate, and what looked like document boxes sealed with wax. Christopher started down the stairs, but Rebecca caught his arm. Wait, if Edward Cross built this, he built it to last. But 50 years is a long time. Let me check the air first. She dropped a lit match down the stairs, watched it burn steadily until it hit the floor. No foul gases, no oxygen starvation. The chamber had ventilation, somehow probably hidden vents in the walls. They descended together, flashlight beam cutting through dust that rose in clouds with each step. The air smelled like concrete and rust, and the particular staleness of spaces sealed for generations. The first safe had a combination lock, but the key from the well fit a bypass keyhole on the side. Rebecca turned it, and the lock disengaged. Inside, wrapped in cloth bags that had rotted to threads, bearer bonds, dozens of them. She lifted one, saw the denomination printed across the top in ornate script. $1,000. She counted 47 bonds total, ranging from $1,000 to $10,000 each. Christopher was opening the second safe. Gold coins more than in the test cache above. Jewelry, diamond brooches, a sapphire ring, a pocket watch with engraving on the case. All of it old quality, the kind of pieces that held value independent of fashion. The wooden crate held documents, land deeds going back to 1944, mineral rights, timber contracts, survey maps showing parcels that added up to something much larger than the few acres Kenneth Taylor had mentioned. Rebecca spread them on the concrete floor, hands shaking, and started adding in her head. 340 acres. Not the small plot she had inherited, but a patchwork of holdings that Edward Cross had assembled over decades and then hidden from his own family. At the bottom of the crate, sealed in its own wax-lined box, was a letter. Rebecca broke the seal, unfolded paper that had stayed dry and intact because someone had cared enough to preserve it. If you're reading this, greed didn't find it first. Total value, $3.2 million in 1982 dollars. Adjusted for time, likely $8 to $10 million. Now, but here's what you must understand. My own sons would have burned this mountain for that money. I hid it from blood because blood proved unworthy. Use this to build what money can't buy: safety, shelter, second chances. If you sell it all and walk away rich, you've learned nothing. If you turn it into mercy, you've understood everything. Rebecca read it 3 times, each word settling deeper. $8 to $10 million, hidden under a $50 cabin by a man who trusted strangers more than family. And he was right to do it, because Donald Wilson had shown up within 24 hours of a single gold coin appearing in town, and he had come with cash and threats dressed as concern. Christopher was counting bonds, his lips moving silently. When he finished, his face was pale. "Mom, if these are still valid, if they're worth face value plus interest, we need a lawyer, a real one, not just Kenneth Taylor." But even as she said it, Rebecca knew the danger. Going to a lawyer meant creating a paper trail, meant people asking questions, meant words spreading through the same networks that had brought Donald Wilson to their door. They spent the next hour cataloging everything in the chamber. The bonds totaled $287,000 in face value, but if they had accrued interest over 40 years, the real value could be 3 or 4 times that. The gold and jewelry Christopher estimated conservatively at $500,000. The land deeds were harder to value, but 340 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains, even if half of it was too steep to develop, was worth millions. Edward Cross had not been exaggerating. This was generational wealth, hidden and waiting. Rebecca climbed back up to the cabin, pulled out her phone. No signal like always. She would have to drive to town to make the call. But first, they needed to secure everything. The chamber could be sealed again, the floor closed, the stove pushed back into place. Anyone searching the cabin would find only what they had already found: an empty vault, and evidence that someone had been looking. She was halfway through lowering the bonds back into the safe when Christopher's voice cut through her thoughts. "Mom, someone's coming." She heard it then. An engine. Close. Rebecca scrambled up the stairs, Christopher right behind her. They reached the main floor as headlights swept across the cabin walls. Not the Mercedes. Not the black pickup. Something else. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Voices male discussing something Rebecca could not make out. Then the sound of boots on the porch. Rebecca moved to the door, heart hammering. Through the gap in the curtains, she saw two men. One was older, heavy-set, wearing a sheriff's department jacket. The other was younger, civilian clothes, carrying what looked like surveying equipment. The knock was authoritative, official. Rebecca opened the door. The deputy nodded at her, polite but not warm. "Mrs. Anderson, Deputy Frank Morrison. This is Timothy Hayes, County Assessor. We're here to conduct a property evaluation." Rebecca's mind raced. "I wasn't notified." "Emergency assessment. We received a complaint about unpermitted structural modifications and possible code violations. Mr. Hayes needs to inspect the premises." Rebecca did not move from the doorway. "Complaint from who?" Morrison's expression did not change. "Anonymous. But we're required to investigate. This won't take long if you cooperate." Christopher appeared behind Rebecca. Timothy Hayes was already looking past them into the cabin, noting the moved stove, the disturbed floor, the tools scattered around. Rebecca had no choice. Refusing would create suspicion, possibly give them grounds for a warrant. She stepped aside. "Go ahead." Hayes moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, making notes on a tablet, photographing walls and ceiling. Morrison stayed near the door, watching Rebecca more than Hayes, his hand resting casually near his sidearm in the way cops did when they expected potential trouble. Hayes stopped at the wood stove. "You've been doing renovation work." "Just cleaning." "Cabin like this, moving a cast-iron stove, counts as structural modification. You pull permits for that." Rebecca's throat tightened. "I didn't know I needed them." Hayes made a note. He walked to where the floor panel had been, now closed but not perfectly flush. Knelt down, ran his fingers along the seam. What's under here? Storage space. The cabin was built with a root cellar. "Mind if I look?" Rebecca's pulse thundered in her ears. The crank mechanism was still visible if he looked at the stove's base. The chamber below held millions in assets that she had not declared that legally might not even be hers until probate cleared. "I'd prefer you didn't. There's mold down there. I haven't had time to remediate it yet." Hayes looked at Morrison. Something passed between them, unspoken communication. Morrison spoke. "We'll need to verify that. If there's black mold, that's a health code violation. We might have to red tag the structure." Red tag meant condemned, meant she could not legally occupy it, meant they would seal it while she fought bureaucracy, and during that time, anyone with a key or a crowbar could walk in and take everything. Rebecca made a decision born of desperation. "It's just regular mold, probably from water seepage. I can clean it myself." Hayes smiled thinly. "I'm sure you can, but we still need to document it for our report." He reached for the floor panel. Christopher stepped forward. "You need a warrant for that." Morrison's hand moved closer to his sidearm. "Son, this is a safety inspection. We don't need a warrant for code enforcement." Rebecca's mind spun through options. All of them bad. She could fight, claim privacy, force them to get a warrant. But that would buy maybe a day, and they would come back with more people, more authority. Or she could cooperate, show them the chamber, and pray they did not recognize what they were looking at. Before she could decide, the sound of another engine cut through the tension. All four of them turned toward the door. George Allen's pickup rolled into the clearing, moving faster than the old man usually drove. He got out, saw the sheriff's vehicle, and his face hardened into an expression Rebecca had not seen before. Anger barely controlled. "Frank Morrison, what the hell are you doing on private property without a notice of inspection?" Morrison's posture shifted, became defensive. "We got a complaint, George. Anonymous tip about code violations." "Anonymous?" George climbed the porch steps, moving between Rebecca and the deputy like he had every right to be there. "And who do you suppose made that call? Frank, who stands to benefit from this cabin being condemned?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to serve and protect, not harass a woman who just inherited her family's property. You got actual evidence of violations, or are you fishing on someone else's behalf?" Hayes started to speak, but George cut him off. "Timothy, I've known your father since before you were born. He taught you better than to come sniffing around a property at the behest of developers. You find actual violations, you document them proper, and give Mrs. Anderson time to remedy. You don't show up with threats and intimidation." Morrison's face flushed. "Mr. Allen, you need to step aside and let us complete our assessment. You completed it when you saw the cabin was occupied and structurally sound. Anything beyond that requires notice and consent, and you know it." The two men stared at each other, decades of small-town hierarchy playing out in silent combat. Finally, Morrison looked at Hayes. "Get what you need for the report. We're leaving in 5 minutes." Hayes photographed the stove, the floor, the general condition of the cabin, made notes, asked no more questions. When they left, Morrison paused at his vehicle. "Mrs. Anderson, you'll receive official notice if any violations require remediation. You have 30 days to respond." Then they were gone, leaving dust and the smell of threat hanging in the air. George watched them drive away before turning to Rebecca. "You need to understand something. Donald Wilson owns half the county commission. He can make your life very difficult if you stand in his way." Rebecca's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What does he want?" "Same thing men like him always want. Everything. And if he can't buy it, he'll bury it in regulations and legal fees until you give up and sell cheap." George looked at the cabin, at the moved stove, at the evidence of discovery that was too obvious to hide. "How much did you find?" Rebecca considered lying, decided George had earned truth. "Enough to make this worth fighting for." George nodded slowly. "Then you better get a lawyer who specializes in property law and estate disputes. Kenneth Taylor is fine for simple transfers, but this is going to get complicated and expensive." He left her with the name of a firm in Asheville, one that had handled cross-family business before. Rebecca stood in the clearing as his truck disappeared, Christopher beside her, both of them silent with the weight of what they now understood. The inheritance was real, millions of dollars real, life-changing real, and people were already coming for it. They worked through the night, moving everything from the chamber to the Toyota, hiding it under sleeping bags and clothes, making it look like ordinary belongings. The bonds, the deeds, the gold, the jewelry, all of it packed carefully, locked in the trunk. Rebecca kept Edward Cross's letter separate, reading it again by flashlight, while Christopher slept fitfully in the passenger seat. If you turn it into mercy, you've understood everything. Mercy, not profit, not escape. Mercy. She thought about the man who had been living in the cabin before them, the one with the duct-taped boots and hollow eyes. She thought about the security guard at Walmart, who had chosen kindness over enforcement. She thought about the women she had met cleaning motel rooms, the ones who were one paycheck away from the parking lot, one injury away from the street. Edward Cross had hidden his fortune from people who saw only money. He had left it for someone who understood that the real poverty was not the lack of wealth, but the absence of shelter, the kind that protected more than bodies. Rebecca folded the letter and put it in her pocket. At dawn, she drove to town, parked outside the law firm George had recommended, and waited for them to open. When the receptionist arrived, Rebecca was standing at the door with every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence she had. The senior partner, a woman named Sharon Blake, listened to Rebecca's story without interrupting, looked at the bonds, the deeds, the letter, made phone calls to appraisers, to probate specialists, to people whose expertise Rebecca could not afford, but who agreed to consultations based on Sharon's word. By noon, the estimate came back. Bearer bonds approximately $1.8 million after accounting for 16 bonds that had expired worthless. Gold and jewelry, $520,000. Land holdings, $2.1 million conservative estimate, assuming 180 acres were saleable and the rest protected forest. Total $4.4 million. Before taxes, before legal fees, before the inevitable challenges from people who would crawl out of the woodwork claiming rights to the Cross estate. Sharon Blake looked at Rebecca across the desk, her expression grim. "Mrs. Anderson, you need to prepare yourself. This will get ugly. Extended family will contest. The county will want tax revenue. Developers will make offers that sound generous, but are designed to steal from you legally. You're going to need at least $200,000 in legal fees to defend this, and even then, I can't promise you'll keep everything." Rebecca thought about the Toyota, about the parking lot, about Christopher's face when he pretended not to be hungry. How long? Best case 8 months, worst case 2 years. And in the meantime, you'll get nothing. Everything stays frozen in probate until ownership is clear. Rebecca stood legs shaking. "Then freeze it, because I'm not selling and I'm not walking away." She drove back to the cabin with papers that proved she was potentially a multimillionaire and a bank account that still held less than $1,000. Christopher was waiting on the porch, tension in every line of his body. "How bad?" Rebecca told him. "All of it. The real value, the legal battle ahead, the money they did not have access to and might not get for years." Christopher listened, then asked the question she had been dreading. "Was it worth it, finding all this, if we can't use it?" Rebecca thought about Edward Cross's letter, about mercy, about the difference between having and hoarding, between wealth and worth. "Ask me again in a year." That night, someone broke into the cabin. Rebecca and Christopher had driven to town for supplies, actual food for once, using money from the pawnshop sale. They came back to find the back door splintered, the frame damaged where someone had pried it open with force. Inside the cabin had been searched, almost ransacked. Whoever did this had been methodical. Drawers opened floorboards, tested walls, tapped. They had found the chamber, descended into it, searched it thoroughly. Rebecca knew because the lid on one of the safes was still open, and there were fresh boot prints in the concrete dust. But they had found nothing because everything valuable was locked in the Toyota's trunk. What they left behind was worse than theft. On the wall, spray-painted in red, "You're sitting on a fortune you don't deserve." Christopher stared at it, face pale. We need to call the police." Rebecca looked at the message, at the violation it represented, and felt something harden inside her. "And tell them what?" "That someone broke into a cabin we barely own and left a message about money we haven't declared. That'll start questions we can't answer." "Then what do we do?" Rebecca pulled out her phone, took photographs of everything: the broken door, the boot prints, the message. Evidence she might need later, proof that the threats were real. "We install better locks. We don't sleep here anymore. And we get ready for war because it's coming whether we want it or not." The newspaper article appeared 3 days later. Amanda Clark, reporter for the Mountain Gazette, had somehow gotten wind of the story. Not the full story. Rebecca had been careful with what she told Sharon Blake's office, but enough. The headline read, "Mystery Fortune at Abandoned Cross Estate." The article was mostly speculation built on the fact that an anonymous source had confirmed bearer bonds from the 1980s had been authenticated through a local law firm. It mentioned Rebecca by name, described her as the unexpected heir to the Cross family holdings, and quoted real estate experts estimating the property's value at several $1,000,000. Within hours, Rebecca's phone, which she had been forced to turn on and keep charged for lawyer communication, started ringing. Kenneth Taylor called first, concerned. "Mrs. Anderson, this article is going to create problems. You should have come to me before going to Sharon Blake." 3 attorneys called offering representation. All of them referenced the article, all of them promising better results than Sharon Blake could deliver. A man claiming to be a Cross descendant called saying he had evidence that Margaret's will was invalid. Donald Wilson called from his personal cell, his voice smooth as oil. "Mrs. Anderson, I saw the article. My offer just went up to $40,000. That's more than fair for the headaches you're about to endure." Rebecca hung up on him. By evening, a woman named Brenda Thompson had arrived at the cabin in a Lexus SUV, dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon, claiming to be Edward Cross's granddaughter through his oldest son. "I'm not here to fight. I just want what's fair. Edward had 6 children. They all deserve a share." Rebecca met her at the door, did not invite her in. "Take it up with my lawyer. This doesn't have to be adversarial. We're family. You didn't think we were family when this place was worth $50. Brenda's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. Fighting us will cost you everything you found." "Then I'll lose it fighting, not give it away to people who showed up the minute there was money to take." She closed the door in Brenda Thompson's face and listened to the Lexus drive away, tires spitting gravel, in anger. That night, Sharon Blake called with news. "Brenda Thompson filed a lawsuit this afternoon. She's claiming Edward Cross was mentally incompetent when he wrote his will that the assets should be redistributed among all descendants. She's got 2 other family members signed on as co-plaintiffs." Rebecca sat down heavily. "How do we fight it?" "Medical records. We prove Edward was competent. I've already filed for discovery. But Rebecca, this is exactly what I warned you about. They're going to drag this out, make it expensive, try to force you into a settlement." "What would a settlement look like?" "They'd probably offer you 10%, maybe 20% if we fight hard." 10% of $4.4 million was still more money than Rebecca had ever imagined having. But it was not what Edward Cross had wanted. He had hidden this from people exactly like Brenda Thompson, people who measured worth in dollars and saw family as competition. "No settlement. We fight." Sharon was quiet for a moment. "Then get ready. This is going to consume your life for the next year minimum." Rebecca ended the call and looked at Christopher, who had been listening from the floor where they now spread sleeping bags every night, too paranoid to sleep soundly. We could walk away, take what we found in the first vault, and disappear. Christopher shook his head. That's not enough to start over, not really, and if we run, they'll chase us forever, claiming we stole it. He was right. Rebecca knew it. Running meant guilt. Fighting meant pain. She chose pain. The calls continued for days. Lawyers, reporters, people claiming to be relatives Rebecca had never heard of. Donald Wilson called twice more each time, increasing his offer. 45,000, 50,000. Each increase a confirmation that he knew the real value and was betting Rebecca would crack under pressure. She did not crack, but she put. On the 7th day after the article, she stood in the cabin and looked at the spray-painted message that she still had not cleaned off. You don't deserve. Maybe they were right. Maybe she did not deserve millions of dollars for being related to someone she had never met. Maybe none of this made sense, but Edward Cross's letter did not say she deserved it. It said she had arrived hollow and looked past comfort for survival. It said wisdom saw shelter first. Rebecca pulled the letter from her pocket and read the final lines again. If you turn it into mercy, you've understood everything. The answer had been there all along, not in keeping the money, not in spending it on herself, in using it the way Edward had wanted to build something that outlasted greed. She called Sharon Blake. How much of the estate can I access before probate clears? Legally nothing. Practically, if you can prove immediate need for property maintenance or safety concerns, maybe 50,000. Get me that 50,000. I'm hiring contractors. For what? Rebecca looked around the cabin, at the broken door, at the violated space, at the structure that had sheltered her first night off the streets in nearly a year. Repairs? Expansion? I'm building something. Sharon started to argue, but Rebecca cut her off. Edward Cross told me what to do with this place. I'm doing it. Fight the lawsuits, protect the estate, but get me access to enough money to make this cabin into something that matters. She hung up before Sharon could respond. Christopher was staring at her. What are you planning? Rebecca looked at him. At this boy who had grown harder and smarter and more careful than any 16-year-old should have to be, and made a choice that was either brilliant or insane. I'm building a shelter for women like me, like we were, like we still are. With money we don't technically have yet. With faith that Edward Cross knew what he was doing when he left it to someone who knows what poverty feels like. It was not hope exactly. Hope required optimism, required belief that things would work out. This was something more dangerous and more durable. This was purpose. The courtroom in Appalachian County smelled like floor polish and old wood, the kind of institutional scent that made Rebecca's stomach turn. She had been inside a courtroom exactly once before, 3 years ago, when a debt collector had sued her over unpaid medical bills. That time she had sat small and ashamed while a judge ruled against her in under 5 minutes. This time, when she walked through the door with Sharon Blake beside her and Christopher at her back, men in expensive suits looked up from polished tables and measured her like a problem requiring calculation. Donald Wilson sat 3 rows behind the plaintiff's table, not officially part of the proceedings, but present nonetheless, his silver hair and camel coat, a declaration of interest that needed no legal standing. Brenda Thompson occupied the plaintiff's chair, flanked by 2 attorneys whose hourly rates probably exceeded what Rebecca used to make in a week. Behind them, sat two other Cross descendants, names Rebecca had learned from legal documents, Richard Cross and Patricia Dalton, both claiming blood rights to property they had ignored for decades. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray hair, pulled severe eyes that had seen enough estate fights to be permanently exhausted by human greed. She reviewed the files without expression while everyone settled into their seats. Sharon leaned close, voice barely audible. "Remember what we discussed. Don't react to anything they say. Let me handle the arguments." Rebecca nodded, hands clasped tight in her lap to stop them shaking. Christopher sat in the gallery behind her, close enough that she could hear him breathing steady and controlled despite the fear she knew was eating him from the inside. Brenda Thompson's attorney stood first, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who moved with the practiced ease of someone who won more often than he lost. His opening was clean, precise, surgical. "Your Honor, this case concerns the illegal concealment of assets from rightful heirs. Edward Cross, the original owner of said assets, exhibited documented paranoid behavior in his final years. Medical records show multiple complaints to his physician about family members attempting to poison him, about government surveillance, about conspiracies to steal his property. This is not the mental state of a man capable of making sound testamentary decisions." Sharon was on her feet immediately. "Objection. Mr. Hutchins is mischaracterizing the evidence. Edward Cross's medical records show no diagnosis of dementia, no cognitive impairment. Paranoia about family theft is not irrational when the family in question proves him right by filing suit the moment assets become public." The judge did not look amused. "Save the editorializing for closing arguments, Ms. Blake. Mr. Hutchins, do you have actual medical testimony, or are you speculating?" Hutchins pulled a document from his file. "We have sworn affidavit from Dr. Robert Kensington, Mr. Cross's physician, from 1978 to 1982, stating that Edward exhibited unusual fixation on security measures and expressed distrust of close relatives without apparent cause." Sharon stood again. "Unusual fixation is not a medical diagnosis, Your Honor. Dr. Kensington's notes from the same period indicate Edward Cross was lucid, capable, and making rational business decisions right up until his death. The distrust of relatives had apparent cause. Specifically, his sons were actively contesting ownership of family land while Edward was still alive." The judge made a note. "I'll allow the affidavit into evidence. Continue, Mr. Hutchins." The argument went on for 2 hours. Legal language, stacking on precedent, stacking on technicality. Rebecca understood perhaps half of it. What she understood clearly was that Brenda Thompson's case rested on painting Edward Cross as a paranoid old man whose hidden assets should be divided among all descendants because concealment itself proved incompetence. Sharon's counterargument was simpler. Edward Cross had every right to dispose of his property as he wished. The concealment was intentional and legal, and the current claimants had shown no interest in Margaret Cross or her estate until money entered the equation. During a brief recess, Rebecca stepped outside for air. Christopher followed, neither of them speaking until they were alone in the hallway. "How's it going?" Rebecca could not read her son's expression, could not tell if he wanted reassurance or truth. "Sharon thinks we'll win, but she also thought this would be cleaner than it is." Christopher leaned against the wall, suddenly looking more tired than 16 should allow. "What if we don't win?" Rebecca had been avoiding that question, pushing it down every time it surfaced. Now, standing in a courthouse hallway with everything they had found hanging in the balance, She could not avoid it anymore. Then we lose, and we go back to what we were before we found any of this. The Toyota. The Toyota. Christopher was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice came out harder than she expected. I don't think I can do that again. Go back to living in a car, pretending I'm not hungry, watching you pretend you're not falling apart. Rebecca's throat closed. She had known Christopher was struggling, had seen it in the careful way he moved through the world, now always calculating, always braced for loss. But hearing him say it, the flat certainty that he could not survive another descent, broke something in her chest. Then we fight harder. Sharon appeared at the end of the hallway, gesturing them back. The recess was over. The afternoon session began with Hutchins calling his first witness, Brenda Thompson herself. She took the stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed, answered the oath, and settled into her chair like it was a throne. Hutchins walked her through her credentials as Edward Cross's granddaughter, through her memories of family gatherings, through the story of a grandfather who had grown increasingly paranoid and isolated in his final years. Did Edward ever discuss his assets with you? Brenda's voice carried perfectly to every corner of the courtroom. Never. He refused to talk about money with any of us. When my father tried to discuss estate planning, Edward accused him of plotting to steal from him. And what was your father's response? He stopped trying. We all did. It was too painful to watch someone we loved spiral into paranoia. Sharon stood for cross-examination, and Rebecca watched her approach the stand with the careful precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. Miss Thompson, when did you last see Edward Cross before he died? Brenda hesitated just slightly. I don't recall exactly. Several years before. Try to be more specific. Was it 5 years, 10? Perhaps 15. I was living in Atlanta at the time. It was difficult to visit. Sharon pulled a document from her file. According to records, Edward Cross died in 1982. You were living in Asheville from 1977 to 1985, less than 40 miles from his property. Yet, you visited him 0 times in those 5 years? Brenda's face tightened. Our relationship was strained. He had pushed us away. Or you found it inconvenient to maintain contact with a man you describe as paranoid and difficult until his assets became public knowledge. 40 years later, Hutchins objected. The judge sustained it, but the damage was visible in Brenda's expression. Sharon continued, voice level. You testified Edward refused to discuss money. Did he refuse to discuss anything else? I don't understand the question. Did you ever ask him about his life, his health, whether he needed anything? Of course. Yet you visited him 0 times in 5 years. Curious definition of course. The cross-examination went on, Sharon systematically dismantling Brenda's image as the concerned granddaughter, wrongfully excluded from inheritance. By the time Brenda stepped down, her composure had cracked enough that Rebecca could see the anger underneath the fury of someone who believed money should flow along bloodlines regardless of effort or care. Hutchins called 2 more witnesses, both Cross descendants, who testified to Edward's paranoia, his isolation, his unreasonable distrust. Sharon cross-examined each one with the same question, when did you last visit him? None of them had seen Edward Cross in the decade before his death. Then Sharon called her witness, Kenneth Taylor. The attorney who had first contacted Rebecca took the stand looking uncomfortable, like he wished he were anywhere else. Sharon walked him through the will, through Margaret Cross's clear competence, when she updated her estate documents, through the legal validity of every transfer and deed. Mr. Taylor, in your professional opinion, Was there anything irregular about Margaret Cross's will? Kenneth's voice was firm. Nothing. She was lucid specific about her intentions and legally sound in all regards. And the property transferred to Rebecca Anderson. Completely valid. Margaret Cross named her specifically as next of kin, entitled to receive the cabin and any associated assets. Sharon thanked him and sat down. Hutchins stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Taylor, were you aware of the concealed assets when you contacted Mrs. Anderson?" "No." "So as far as you knew, you were transferring a worthless cabin worth $50? That was the county assessment, yes. And you found nothing suspicious in Margaret Cross leaving a $50 cabin to a relative she had never met." Kenneth hesitated, choosing words carefully. "Estate law doesn't require relatives to know each other. It requires legal documentation of relationship which existed." Hutchins smiled. "So you're telling this court that a woman leaving her entire estate, an estate we now know to be worth millions to a stranger, is perfectly normal?" "I'm telling this court it's perfectly legal." The judge called for a lunch recess. Rebecca found she could not eat stomach too tight with nerves. Christopher managed half a sandwich, forcing it down mechanically. Sharon reviewed notes, making annotations, preparing for the afternoon. When they reconvened, Hutchins made his closing argument. It was elegant, compelling, built on the foundation of family duty and shared inheritance. He painted Edward Cross as a tragic figure mentally unwell, whose final paranoid act had been to hide wealth that should have been distributed equitably. He described Rebecca as an opportunistic stranger who had stumbled into money she had no moral right to keep. "Your Honor, the law exists to prevent exactly this kind of injustice. A man's lifetime of accumulated wealth, hidden away due to mental illness, now claimed entirely by someone with no connection to his life, his legacy, his family. The Cross descendants are not asking for charity. They are asking for what is rightfully theirs by blood and by law." Sharon's closing was different. She did not argue emotion or fairness. She argued documentation, legal precedent, the explicit right of property owners to dispose of assets as they chose. "Your Honor, Edward Cross was not mentally ill. He was justifiably cautious about family members who proved by their own testimony to have abandoned him in his final years. The plaintiffs visited him 0 times in his final decade. They showed no interest in Margaret Cross or her estate until money became public. This is not a case about fairness. This is a case about people who ignored their family until inheritance made attention profitable." She paused, let the words settle. "The law does not require property owners to reward neglect with wealth. Edward Cross chose to leave his estate to someone who might value it for reasons beyond profit. That choice was legal, documented, and binding. This court should uphold it." The judge thanked both attorneys and turned to Rebecca. "Mrs. Anderson, do you wish to make a statement before I review the evidence?" Rebecca had not prepared anything. Sharon had advised against it, said letting the lawyers handle everything was safer. But sitting in that courtroom listening to Brenda Thompson and her relatives describe Edward Cross as mentally incompetent, listening to them argue that poverty made Rebecca morally unfit for inheritance, something hardened inside her chest. She stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak." Sharon's hand touched her arm, warning, but Rebecca was already moving toward the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. Rebecca sat, looked at Brenda Thompson, at Donald Wilson, in his expensive coat, at all the people who had come running the moment they smelled money. The judge nodded. "Go ahead, Mrs. Anderson." Rebecca's voice came out quieter than she intended, but steady. When that cabin was worthless, nobody wanted it. When it was rotting in the mountains and assessed at $50, nobody showed up to claim it. Nobody filed paperwork. Nobody expressed interest. I inherited it because nobody else thought it was worth the effort. She looked directly at Brenda Thompson. You didn't visit Edward Cross in 10 years. You didn't visit Margaret Cross at all. You didn't care about that property or that family until you read in the newspaper that money might be involved. That's not inheritance. That's scavenging. Hutchins started to object, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. Rebecca continued, words coming faster now. I don't know if I deserve this money. Maybe I don't. But I know what poverty feels like. I know what it's like to sleep in a car and pretend to your child that things will get better when you don't believe it yourself. I know what it feels like when people stop seeing you as human and start seeing you as a problem to be managed or ignored. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. Edward Cross wrote that if greed found his money first, it would be spent on vanity. If wisdom found it, it would be turned into shelter. I'm not wise. I'm just desperate enough to understand what he meant. This money isn't for me to hoard. It's for me to use to build something that outlasts greed, that protects people who need protecting. She looked at the judge. These people fighting for a share, they have houses. They have security. They'll take this money and add it to what they already have, and it won't change their lives except to make them slightly richer. But there are women out there right now, sleeping in cars, with their kids working 2 jobs, and still coming up short, one bad day away from losing everything. That's who this inheritance is for. That's who Edward Cross was trying to reach across 50 years. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Rebecca's throat tightened, but she forced out the final words. So no, I don't deserve this money more than anyone else, but I'll use it better than people who only want it because it exists. She stepped down, legs shaking, and returned to her seat. Sharon was staring at her, expression unreadable. Christopher had tears running down his face, silent and unashamed. The judge made notes for several long minutes, then looked up. I'll review all evidence and testimony. You'll receive my ruling within 2 weeks. Court is adjourned. The walk out of the courthouse felt surreal. Reporters waited on the steps, but Sharon deflected them with practiced efficiency. Rebecca climbed into the Toyota Christopher beside her, and they sat in the parking lot while her hands stopped shaking enough to drive. Christopher's voice was rough. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Rebecca started the engine. Probably both. They drove back to the cabin in silence, both of them too wrung out for conversation. The weight of waiting settled over them like fog. 2 weeks became 12 days. Sharon called on the morning of the 12th day, voice carefully neutral. The judge ruled in your favor. The transfer is upheld. Brenda Thompson's claim is dismissed. Rebecca sat down hard on the cabin floor. We won. You won. But Rebecca, there's more you need to understand. Sharon walked her through the reality. Yes, the estate was legally hers. Yes, the assets would be released from probate. But the actual cash value after taxes and fees, and the harsh mathematics of turning old assets into liquid money, was significantly less than the estimate. The bearer bonds, only 31 of 47, were still valid. Total value after redemption and taxes, $1.8 million. The jewelry and gold, $520,000 after appraisal and sale. The land, 180 acres, could be sold. The rest was protected forest under conservation easement Edward had established decades ago. Sale price in current market $2.1 million. Subtotal $4.42 million. Federal taxes at 35%, $1.55 million. State taxes at 7%, $310,000. Legal fees, $200,000. Assessment and processing fees, $90,000. Net amount. Rebecca would actually receive $2.27 million. Not the $8 million Edward's letter had promised. Not even half that. Rebecca listened to the numbers, felt each one land like a punch, and thought about all the plans she had started making, all the women she had imagined helping, all the rooms she had pictured building. $2.27 million. Sharon's voice was gentle. It's still more money than most people see in a lifetime, but I need you to understand you won't receive it all at once. Liquidating the assets will take 8 to 10 months. You'll get distributions in stages. How much now? I can get you $200,000 within 30 days. The rest comes as assets sell. $200,000. Not enough to build the vision in Rebecca's head, enough to start maybe, enough to prove concept, enough to choose between safety and service. Christopher was listening from across the room, face pale. That's still good, right? $2 million is still good. Rebecca looked at him, at this boy who had learned to calculate survival in dollars and days, and felt the weight of choice pressing down. It's good, but it's different than what we thought. That night, Donald Wilson called. Rebecca almost ignored it, but curiosity won. His voice was smooth, congratulatory. Mrs. Anderson, I heard about the ruling. Congratulations. You fought hard and won. What do you want? To make a final offer, $3 million for everything, the cabin, the land, the assets, still in probate. Cash delivered within 48 hours. More than you'll net after liquidation, and you get it immediately. $3 million. It was more than she would get otherwise, and she would get it now, before months of waiting, before the risk of market changes or legal complications. Rebecca looked around the cabin at the repairs they had started, at the foundation of something larger taking shape. No. Mrs. Anderson, be practical. You won the legal battle, but you're about to lose the financial one. Liquidating assets takes time. Markets change. You could end up with significantly less than my offer. Then I'll end up with less. Donald's voice cooled. You're making a mistake. It won't be my first. She hung up and turned off her phone. Christopher was staring at her. Mom, that was $3 million. I know. We could buy a house. You could stop working. I could go to any college. I know that too. Her voice came out harder than intended. Christopher flinched, and Rebecca immediately regretted it. She softened, tried again. Listen to me. Edward Cross didn't hide his money so someone could sell it to Donald Wilson. He hid it so it could be used for something better than profit. But we'd have the money. We could use it however we want. Could we, after we bought the house and paid for college and covered all the things we've been desperate for, how much would be left? And what would we do with that? Christopher had no answer. Rebecca did not have one either, not a complete one, just the memory of Edward's letter, the weight of his expectations, the understanding that some choices changed who you were, regardless of outcome. She thought about Kathleen Robinson. The name had been circling in her head for days, coming back at odd hours. Kathleen, who had managed the weekly motel, where Rebecca and Christopher had stayed for 3 weeks after losing the house. Kathleen, who had let Rebecca slide when she was short on rent 1 week, who had given Christopher extra towels and never mentioned the camping stove they used in the bathroom. Rebecca had promised to pay her back, had never been able to. She found Kathleen 3 days later working the register at a Food Lion in Asheville. Kathleen looked older than Rebecca remembered, worn down by more than just years. Her hands shook slightly when she counted change. Rebecca waited until Kathleen's shift ended, then approached her in the parking lot. Recognition came slowly to Kathleen's face, then surprise. "Rebecca, my lord, is that really you?" They stood in the parking lot while evening traffic hummed past two women who had last seen each other when one had nothing and the other had barely more. Kathleen asked about Christopher, about how they were doing, and Rebecca told the abbreviated version: inheritance, legal battle, uncertain future. Kathleen's face showed genuine happiness. "I'm so glad. You deserved something good after everything." Rebecca took a breath. "Where are you living now?" Kathleen's expression closed slightly. "I've got a room. It's fine." "Kathleen," the older woman looked away, "I lost the motel job 8 months ago. New owners brought in their own people. I'm renting a room in someone's basement. Working here, part-time. It's enough to get by." Rebecca knew what "enough to get by" meant. It meant one missed shift from disaster, one unexpected expense from the street. "I'm building something, a place, for women who need somewhere safe while they rebuild." Kathleen's eyes filled, but she did not cry. "That's good. That's real good. I want you to be the first person to come stay there." Kathleen shook her head. "Rebecca, I don't need charity." "Neither did I, but you gave it to me anyway when I had nowhere else to go." The words hung between them. Kathleen looked at Rebecca for a long moment, measuring sincerity against pride, need against dignity. "Let me think about it." Rebecca gave her a number, Sharon Blake's office line, and watched Kathleen drive away in a car that sounded worse than the Toyota used to. Construction began in early October, 8 months after Rebecca had first opened the door to a $50 cabin and found Edward Cross's faith in human nature buried under floorboards. Stephen Clark, the contractor George Allen had recommended, brought a crew of 3 and a realistic timeline, not the 6 weeks Rebecca had hoped for. 6 months minimum to add 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, expand the kitchen, reinforce the foundation, and bring everything up to code. The $200,000 Sharon had secured would cover maybe 80% of it. Rebecca would need to borrow against future distributions, take on debt she had spent years trying to escape. She signed the contracts anyway. Christopher enrolled in community college, living in the cabin while construction transformed it around him, studying architecture while watching the practical application of load-bearing walls and proper ventilation. He stopped asking when they would get a real house. Maybe he had figured out they were building one. Maybe he had accepted that it was not just for them. George Allen died in November peacefully in his sleep, according to the brief obituary in the Mountain Gazette. His daughter called Rebecca, said George had left an envelope with her name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Rebecca, you did what Edward hoped someone would. The mountains remember kindness longer than they remember money." George Rebecca folded the letter carefully and put it with Edward's 2 old men, separated by decades, both believing in the possibility that strangers might be better than blood. By March, the cabin had been transformed. Not grand, not luxurious, but solid. 3 bedrooms simply furnished. A kitchen with appliances that worked. Heating that kept the mountain cold at bay. A porch that no longer listed with railings that could hold weight. The sign Stephen Clark installed was plain wood, no flourishes, Cross House. Underneath smaller, a temporary home for women rebuilding. Linda Scott arrived on a Tuesday in April, everything she owned packed in 2 grocery bags. She was 61, had been sleeping in her Corolla for 3 weeks after her son emptied her bank account and disappeared. A church volunteer had given her Rebecca's number. Linda stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the cabin, the same way Rebecca once had, with suspicion first, then exhaustion, then the dangerous tremor of hope. "I can't pay." Rebecca held the door open. "You're not supposed to." That night, Linda slept in a real bed for the first time in 23 days, door locked against the world, and Rebecca stood in the hallway outside and cried quietly into her hand. Not from sadness, from the completion of something larger than money, the understanding that some debts were paid forward instead of back. Kathleen Robinson moved in 2 weeks later, not as a guest, but as live-in staff, helping Rebecca manage the logistics of running a shelter on donated funds and stubborn faith. She had her own room small, but hers, and on the day she moved in, she stood in the doorway and said only, "Thank you." Rebecca shook her head. "You helped me when I had nothing. This is just returning the favor with interest." By the 1-year anniversary of inheriting the cabin, Crosshouse had helped 7 women. 4 had moved on to jobs and apartments, rebuilding lives that had seemed irretrievably broken. 3 were still in residence, including Kathleen, who had quietly become essential to operations. The local paper ran a story written by Amanda Clark with care and respect this time. Donations started arriving. Small amounts, mostly $20 here, $50 there, but they added up. Enough to keep the lights on, to keep the pantry stocked, to prove that strangers could be kinder than family when given the chance. Christopher came home from his first semester of college with design sketches for expanding Crosshouse plans, for adding capacity without losing the intimate safety that made it work. He had grown taller somehow, or maybe just stood straighter, like weight had been lifted from shoulders too young to carry it. One evening in late autumn, he found Rebecca on the porch, reading Edward Cross's letter, for perhaps the 100th time, the paper soft with handling. "You read that a lot." She looked up. "It reminds me why we're doing this." Christopher sat beside her, both of them, watching light fade from the mountains, turning the pines into silhouettes against darkening sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd sold to Donald Wilson, taken the money and run?" Rebecca thought about it honestly, every day. "Some days I think we'd be happier, easier anyway. But I wouldn't know if we could do this, build something that matters, turn loss into purpose." Christopher was quiet for a moment. "You remember what I said at the courthouse, that I couldn't go back to living in the car?" "I remember. I was wrong. I could have gone back. What I couldn't do was live my whole life knowing we had a chance to be better than we were, and chose comfort instead." Rebecca looked at her son, this person who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had learned too young what poverty could do to hope. But somewhere in the hardness, he had also learned what it meant to choose meaning over safety. She pulled him close, his head on her shoulder, like when he was small. "Your father would be proud of you." Would he be proud of you? Rebecca thought about Michael, about the man who used to kiss her forehead and whistle while fixing broken things, about the person she had been when he was alive versus the person loss had carved her into. "I hope so, but honestly, I'm not doing this for him, or for Edward Cross, or even for the women who come through here." "Who then?" Rebecca looked out at the cabin, at the warm light spilling from windows that once held only darkness. For me, because I needed to know that being broken doesn't mean being useless, that sometimes the people who have lost the most are the only ones who understand what's worth saving. They sat in silence while the mountain wind moved through the trees carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke and possibility. In the years since inheriting a $50 cabin, Rebecca Anderson had gained $2.27 million, lost half of it to taxes and fees, spent most of what remained on a building that would never make her rich, and discovered that wealth had nothing to do with bank balances. She had learned that broken things cabins, people, hearts could still shelter life if someone was brave enough to see past the rot to the frame underneath. That dignity could return after being stripped away. That sometimes strangers proved more trustworthy than blood. The inheritance had not been the money, not really. It had been the right to turn shelter into safety for someone who would come after hollow and desperate, and needing to believe the world had not completely forgotten mercy. Inside Cross House, Kathleen was making dinner, the smell of cooking drifting through open windows. Linda was reading in the common room, safe behind locked doors. Another woman would arrive tomorrow, referred by a social worker who had heard about the place where judgment took a backseat to hot meals and clean sheets. The cabin that nobody wanted had become the place everybody needed. Rebecca folded Edward Cross's letter and tucked it back in her pocket. Come on. Kathleen's making pot roast, and if we're late, she'll give our portions to whoever shows up hungry. Christopher smiled. So basically everybody. Basically everybody. They went inside, closing the door against the gathering dark, and the cabin held them the way it had held Rebecca and Christopher that first terrified night when they had locked themselves in and hoped morning would bring answers. Morning had brought something better than answers. It had brought purpose, and sometimes, when you have lost everything except the will to keep moving, purpose is the only inheritance that matters.